This is part 2 of a series with Stephen Zarlenga, where we look deep into the fundamental concepts of money. What is money and how is it defined? What is the difference between money and credit? What is the history of money? How does religion, government, and private business tie into money? Is nationalizing the money system socialist? And does this concept of money ignore the quote-unquote libertarian issue? What is fiat money? What is the difference between private versus nationalized banks and how they operate? Has there ever been a society to base its money system on gold that did not fall to slavery or serfdom? And why is any of this important for you to understand? And how could it possibly affect your life? Stephen Zarlenga is the founder of the American Monetary Institute, or AMI, which is the leading American monetary think tank for monetary history, theory, and reform. An economic historian and author, Zarlenga provides us the clearest picture of how money and monetary systems work in his incredible 2002 tome, The Lost Science of Money. And he is also the author of the American Monetary Act, submitted to Congress by Dennis Kucinich in March of this year. If you've not already read his book, it's an absolute must-read. So don't attack the messenger. Instead, go out and buy the book and learn for yourself exactly how and why those who promote the gold standard are lying to you. And an important addendum to this show is going to be PBS's series Frontline, and the episode is called The Warning, which will be posted up on the Gnostic Media podcast page for this episode. Stephen, welcome back to Gnostic Media's podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Jan. I just got back from a long trip, but we're doing good.
Well, we didn't quite manage to get through everything we wanted to get through last time you were on the show, so I wanted to have you back on. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And go ahead.
All right. Well, let's start off with, if you could discuss, what is the invisible hand?
The invisible hand? You mean the way economists discuss it?
Exactly.
Well, you have to be careful when you're trying to say what economists mean by their terminology. They're notoriously poor. And I learned a long time ago not to do that, to let them explain themselves, which they have not done. So what they probably mean by the invisible hand is the idea that while they cannot explain why something works, they claim that it does, usually to justify something that there's no good reason for, but that concentrates wealth into the hands of their patrons, those who are paying them. So I don't regard it as a serious thing. In other words, it's a kind of a cop-out.
Right.
They should be called upon to explain why a policy does good, not to say it happens by magic.
The invisible hand. Yeah, and that's pretty funny. And it was something that when I read your book, it was just astounding to discover this whole system based on Adam Smith and this whole idea of the invisible hand, and it's based on a myth. There's nothing there behind it.
They have no evidence, you see, to support their theories. And what we have as evidence is what we see has happened right now to the world. Total destruction. That's the evidence. That's the evidence of the effect of their ideas. We're not calling them murderers. We're not calling them killers. But that's the effect of their ideas. We're not calling them thieves who are concentrating wealth into the hands of other thieves, essentially, but that, again, is the effect. And this represents a huge mistake in methodology, thinking methodology. They don't demand evidence. It's a very unfortunate situation for humanity at this point in time. And we have to get, I'm not going to say back to sound thinking methods, because you could argue, well, when were we there? We have to adopt methodology of thought and action that is related to the real world, not this type of madness. And especially in the monetary area, Alexander Del Mar summed it up very, very well, where he said, economists, as a rule, do not study the history of money. It's much easier to imagine it and deduce the principles of this imaginary knowledge, unquote. Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's what they do. And the media doesn't stop them because the media doesn't know. We have to start adopting good thinking methodology. And one way to start that in the monetary area is for your listeners to read my book, The Lost Science of Money, because that's the methodology that we've used there.
You know, surprisingly, I think that more than any other guest I've had on, I've had quite literally dozens of emails from people that say that they have ordered your book and have just been blown away by it.
That's good. That's good, because that helps the Institute. That's how we are able to stay around and continue our research. We have three sources of income. First, from the book. Second, we have a conference every September at Roosevelt University in Chicago. And the third thing is donations, and it's about evenly split between the three of them. So it's good to hear that, and I want to thank you for bringing attention to it.
Let me ask you what about people who criticize, because you go to the Rockefeller Center, the Rockefeller University there, that you're working for Rockefeller's methods?
What do you mean Rockefeller University?
Isn't that Rockefeller's the university there in Chicago? Isn't that Rockefeller's university?
We've held our conferences at Roosevelt University. It's in downtown Chicago, and it's named after the president and his wife.
Somebody was telling me that they thought that because it was in Chicago, it was part of the Chicago School of Economics, and that was backed by...
No, that kind of thinking, that's not even thinking, that's kind of smearing. That's silly, you know. No, not at all. And Chicago School, the University of Chicago, at one point in time in the 1930s, brought forward the real solution to the problem. Now, after that, something happened there. I'm not sure how. I think the why would be connected with finance, taking some control or some interest there. But during the 30s, the University of Chicago had the best proposal ever to come forward on reforming the money system and taking it away from the private bankers and placing it in the government. In fact, the first two elements of our American Monetary Act came out of what was called the Chicago Plan. And that was to nationalize the Federal Reserve System, put it into the government, and to stop the banks from creating money. You don't get better than that.
What about people who say that to nationalize the money system would be socialist and would just create money and power in the government?
Who cares? Look, that's a kind of a smear, and it's silly. They're probably the same people, Jan, who are saying that to have a decent health care system would be socialist. So if everything good for the citizenship, for the middle class is socialist, well, those people, I don't think it is socialist, but those people, if they identify all the good things for Americans as socialist, then they should start considering whether they want socialism or not. I don't think it's socialism because, you see, Americans should not be afraid of words. Should not. We have to look at what is in harmony with humanity's nature, what works for humanity, and we see things that the first thing you have to understand, socialism also means the fire department. That's socialistic.
So is the military and the police and the
Yeah. But the good, all the good things in society, because they're part of society, you could consider them socialistic. The rule of law, which is crucial to having any society, you could call that socialist too. The order that human beings require to create valuable things for living, to create values for life, that requires a kind of social order. It requires social customs. It's just an attack to scare people. And the way they did it was you're going to be socialist. Oh, well, that becomes communist immediately. And then it's going to be Stalinism and all this stuff. You know, it's kind of a propaganda mechanism to scare Americans. And unfortunately, far too many of our fellow Americans have been too easy to scare.
Well, you know, and to me it actually seems almost like it would be the antithesis of socialism, because you're not creating it based out of these private bankers, and the private bankers are the ones who bankrolled the establishment of communism and this stuff.
You could call the bailout of those characters, of the 25 criminal banks, and the top 25 banks are criminal, and hopefully we'll get enough congressional investigation to demonstrate that, and then take action. You see, we've had a few lawyers at some of our recent meetings, and I've had a discussion with them, you know, openly to the whole group. How can we have the rule of law if we don't examine and punish what those top 25 banks have done? They've not just brought down America, they've brought down the world economies. Now, what has happened in America is people aren't hearing about it at all. In Europe, they are. In Europe, they're talking about this. They can't imagine how stupid we are. But in America, with control of the media being essentially in the financiers' hands, because any media is in debt to its ears, to the banks. That's how Clear Channel got 1,000 stations. They're in debt. And the other 5 or 6 companies that each have 1,000 radio stations. What's happened is we've lost an independent media. And the media is a bit like the nervous system in a body. If you don't have a decent, honest medium, people won't not only not know what to do, they won't know what's happened. They don't know what should be done. You see, this is a crucially important thing. We need monetary reform because it's at the base of all the problem. But at the same time, we need media reform. We need election reform. We need all these things. Now, we can get them all one at a time, and that's the only way we're going to get them. And people who have a particular interest in each area, they should focus on that and immediately get to the point of which laws are required. What is really required of those 535 people who can make the decision? And we only have to get 60 of the senators and 200 and whatever of the House of Representatives, and laws can be passed. That is the way the bad guys have operated. Let's just get that law passed, giving them special privileges, and then they move on to the next one. We have to use the law. We must do that. And that, too, can be considered socialistic in a sense. I wouldn't worry about the label socialism. As the Zulus used to say, put a stone in your stomach. Summon some courage. I'm tired of Americans acting like scared children. I'm very tired of the Congress, House of Representatives, and the senators acting like they're playing in some kind of sandbox. Laws affect lives. Senator Lieberman, if any of your people are from Connecticut, here's a guy who's going to be responsible for the deaths of a lot of Americans by denying them health care when there's no reason to do that. We have the financing to do that when you understand how monetary reform provides the financing.
Right, and that's such a huge issue, is all of these people sit there squabbling about, oh, well, we can't afford this and we'll be paying for immigrants' health care, and I always think, well, in all of the countries I've ever been to, they offered tourists and immigrants health care.
Yes, that's true. If you go through any country in Europe, and if you get ill or you have an accident, they take care of you.
Right, and I've been in the hospital in Europe and South America. In fact, just 5 months ago, I was in the hospital in Peru, and they treated me for a stomach problem that I had been dealing with for 13 years, and they actually cured me in Peru, and my bill after being in the hospital for 5 days was less than $2,000.
Wow.
And that was because I went to a private center, and that's the same treatment would have been $60,000 to $80,000 here.
Wow. So this is why in America it's so important for us to focus on monetary reform, and why whatever type of reform people are interested in, monetary reform has an important role to play in it, in making it possible.
And what people need to understand is if the federal government is manufacturing the money itself, then that money for the health care wouldn't even need to come from taxes in the first place.
No, it would reduce taxes. The idea of private creation of money, putting it into circulation at interest, and taking that interest out of the society as a whole and handing it to those given the privilege to create money. Many of us realize this is insane. And at some point in time, the whole country is going to understand that that is insanity.
In the truest sense of the word.
We have the power to change the system. Jan, what I've come to understand more and more is that there is a kind of psych war being waged against us. Do you know what I mean by that?
Oh, I sure do. Trust me, Stephen.
Okay. I would give these examples of it. We're told nothing you do will matter. You can't change anything. We're discouraged in that way from taking any action. We're told, oh, your government's no good. We're told, oh, your government's so corrupt that you'll never be able to get anything done that's good.
Right. They couldn't run a horror house, so therefore they couldn't do anything else right. That sort of propaganda.
Yeah. So this is propaganda against ourselves because we are the government.
Exactly.
The government has compared to private creation of money, governmental creation of money has a far superior record. But again, as Del Mar said, the economists don't bother to look at the facts. They don't bother to study the history of it. They pretend they've got these theories that, oh, government can't do anything. Well, we found out where that started, where the attack on government started. We know where it is today. Just turn on that horrible Rush Limbaugh show, or Hannity, or these other madmen. Limbaugh is the Protestant maniac. This savage guy is the Jewish maniac on the radio, and Hannity is the Catholic maniac on the radio. So, where did all that start? We traced it back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith began the attack on government. If anyone knows where it started earlier, let us know. But that's where we first find it. And we find it where he smeared the English government because there was talk and there were movements starting to put the money power back into the English government. So he smeared the English government and promoted the privately owned, privately controlled Bank of England. He was a great supporter of the Bank of England without telling people that it was private. He described it in language that you would think it was a public institution. What did he say? He said it operates like a great engine of state. Now, chapter 12 in our book is on has this. I consider it a smoking gun of tracking back this problem, and what it shows us are two things. The reason for the attack on government started in order to keep the monetary power in private hands. So it shows us that, and it shows us how important the monetary power is. If they go through that entire thing of creating this horrible attitude towards government, which is debilitating to all people. If you can be convinced that your government's no good, well, where are you then? Where are the people? That's part of it. Another part of it is to give average people, meaning not very powerful people, to give them a kind of to allow them to scream and shout about the government in any kind of terms. It's a kind of a feeling of power, if you understand what I mean, that you're allowed to attack the government.
Right, and it's the corruption of the private money system in the first place that causes the corruption of the government in the second place.
Yes. There are elements that are, I'll use the term evil, okay? There is such a thing as evil. And a closer definition it would be anyone or someone who purposely holds back the progress of humanity for personal reasons, either financial or mental problems. But those who consciously strive to hold back progress, I would have to say that's evil. And that, by the way, is the same definition of evil that Henry George used, the reformer of the last century.
And something that we'll get into more towards the end of the interview is, these wealthy elites who Ayn Rand portrays as the heroes are not the heroes. They're the ones causing the problem.
Unbelievable, that little woman.
Well, we'll talk.
Could use a different word.
Right. Well, we'll talk about her more in a little bit here. Let's swing around back to that, but I wanted to point that out. Well, and you've brought up Alexander Del Mar a couple of times since we started today, based on your research.
Historian.
Yeah. Well, based on your research and evidence, who were the economists closest to being correct, historically speaking? Was it like Aristotle, Del Mar, Franklin, Jackson, Jefferson, all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above. And, well, Jackson never got it. He didn't fully understand, but he did understand that he had to stop the bankers. That part he understood. He didn't understand what to do afterward.
And he gave the power right back to the bankers by going on the gold standard, correct?
No, not quite. See, Jackson and then Van Buren. Van Buren was his vice president. Van Buren became the next president, and they had the fight with the Second Bank of the United States, and they withdrew government accounts and took that second bank out of any relationship with government, which was good. It was a horrible criminal bank. And then they stopped accepting paper from the state banks unless they were convertible into gold and silver. In other words, they stopped accepting fiat money created by private state banks. Now, the problem that they had was that they did not start issuing government money to take its place. And so under Van Buren, the eighth president, he created, with totally good intent, he created the worst deflation that the country had up until that time. That's in chapter 15, I think, of my book, how they did that. Now, he very quickly began issuing U.S. money when he saw that deflation and the depression that it caused, but he still couldn't get reelected. So, no, it was not that they handed the power back to the bankers. They, unfortunately, did not substitute government-created money after removing banker-created money. Now, this is one of the things that, one of the historical examples we are aware of that gives us the three elements of reform that are crucially necessary. We've isolated those three things from historical case studies where you have to have all three. If you don't have all three, it won't work. And the first is to put the Federal Reserve into the U.S. Treasury as a semi-autonomous body there, where the government creates the money. The second thing, to remove totally the ability of the bankers to create money, to remove the fractional reserve system. Now, the third thing, though, and we know this from Van Buren and Jackson's error, the third part of our act is to have near automatic governmental expenditures for infrastructure, putting new money into circulation, simply spending it into circulation, not loaning it, no interest charges, just spending it. And we know that that's absolutely necessary. One of the case histories is the Van Buren experience, where they didn't do that, and they created a huge deflation and depression. So that's an important thing that we learned from history, and that's our methodology, which is empirical, or what's happened, what are the facts? You see, economists haven't done that, because if they did, they'd have to blame their patrons. They'd have to blame the banking and financial establishment if they actually looked at the facts. So they prefer to live in a world of theory, which can give you any results you want depending on where you start, the axioms that you begin with. So those three elements are necessary. Putting the Fed into the government. People think it is part of the government now, so that's no big change in attitude. You know?
Right.
It's not revolutionary.
When you tell people that the Fed is private, I've gotten into some ridiculous arguments with people that actually believe that it's a federal entity, and they believe Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh and all of this stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't spend much time with it. Just tell them, no, it's not. You're really wrong. Find out about it. Get the information. If it is private, would that upset you? You might ask them. You see, and they get the idea that you speak that with confidence, then they'll start thinking about it. Another thing we learned from history, it's not enough just to do the first thing, just to put the Fed into the government. That alone will not do that, will not solve the problem. And we learned that you also have to stop the banks from creating money. And the historical case study where that is demonstrated is in the nationalization of the Bank of England, which occurred in 1946-7. And that, by the way, came about through a religious organization, the Anglican Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury in 1942, it's the middle of World War II, bombs are falling, hundreds of thousands of Brits are dead. Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, gets up, gives a speech calling for the nationalization of the Bank of England. And the one phrase that summed up his whole thing from his talk was, what should be the servant has become the master. And one of the first things they did in 1946-7, they nationalized, after the war, they nationalized the Bank of England. But they let the banks keep creating money. They didn't stop the banks from their fractional reserve banking. And so what happened? At that point in time, about half the money was created by the British government and half by the banks. But little by little, the bankers took over more and more and more, till today, 97% of British money is created by private banks, 3% by the government. Now, when they took over the Bank of England and it was 50-50, that's when they got their programs, healthcare, other great social programs. They were not afraid to call it socialism, by the way. So what? They wanted the programs. They weren't worried about the terminology and the propaganda. So you have to remove that privilege to create money. That's what that historical case study shows us. It's not enough just to nationalize the Fed. You have to stop the banks from creating money. It's not enough to just nationalize the Fed and to just stop the banks from creating money, as Van Buren did. You have to spend new money into circulation on infrastructure to keep money flowing in a decent amount in the society. And we count healthcare and we count education as part of infrastructure. It's the human infrastructure. You need educated, healthy people to build the hardware and to have a decent society. We're not the products of some angry, fire and brimstone breeding vicious God. That's wrong. That's for sickos. And unfortunately, we got a lot of them. And unfortunately, we seem to have more of them in America than other places. But we can handle it. If we do and try, we can handle it. Not if we're scared of those characters. You cannot be scared of those characters. Look at Bernie Sanders. One of the most beloved senators in America by people from across the country, not just his state. You know what his political party is?
What's that?
He's an admitted socialist. That's how he wins his elections, as a socialist. Maybe it works. Who knows? Maybe we shouldn't be afraid of that word. Now, I think that the free enterprise system, not the capitalist system stinks to hell, but the free enterprise system, that's something to protect, where we have the freedom to act and enough freedom to do things according to the rules,
right?
According to standard. It's not free enterprise. We want it's fair enterprise.
Well, and as you point out in your book, the true capitalists are the communists.
Well, it can get confusing there. I don't think I'd use that.
It's just, it's they. Once it becomes communism, once the bankers form communism, then they really have a monopoly on everything.
Well, it's hard to use these terms effectively because they don't mean very much anymore. Never did. What is socialism? It would take a whole book to figure it out. What is communism? These are loaded terms. They're dirty words. They carry more than a.
They carry emotional baggage with them.
Yeah. And why don't we just try to be good Americans and treat our fellow Americans and fellow men with in a decent way? We know how to do it. Sometimes it takes courage. Have you ever faced evil?
Well, I suppose I have. I don't know how you want to define that.
Oh. You'll know. It's very difficult to face evil. and to admit that it is, that you are facing it. It's like it's something you don't want to do. You don't, it's not healthy for humanity that such things exist. You want to avoid that, but you have to face it, and we have to do that now.
Well, it's just like facing evil with the money system. We have to face it, and we have to understand it so that we can fix it.
The understanding is the important part, and it's the difficult part because there's been so much propaganda invested, billions invested in propaganda to keep people from understanding the money system.
All right.
That goes back to Adam Smith. He went against Aristotle's concept of money. Aristotle gave us the science of money. Money exists not by nature, but by law. Money, Aristotle's concept of money, money is an abstract legal power of society. Adam Smith's concept of money, gold and silver by weight, removing the legal basis of money. Now, that does not fit with the facts of history. It's wrong. And
how do you judge the value of that weight when you exclude things like the slavery and blood labor and things like that that are required to get it?
Yeah. We simply have to do a better job of thinking and understanding this, and not just accepting terminology that's loosely defined, because it doesn't really communicate. It doesn't really tell us what's really going on.
What did Alexander Hamilton do, and how did he die?
Alexander Hamilton, you could say, is the father of banking in America, in one sense. He was good in the Revolution. He fought the Revolution with the guys, but his inclination was towards a certain vision of America based on the Bank of England methodology, not for the Brits, but for people in America, financiers in America. They tried to set up a private money system. Now, what happened at the Constitutional Convention tells us a lot. First, it tells us how important the concept and accurate definition of money is, because what they did was essentially accept Adam Smith's concept of money as gold and silver, for the most part. They did not understand the nature of money properly. And what happened at the convention itself was that they pretty much ignored it. The money power at that time was contained in 5 words: to issue bills of credit. That's what they considered the money power. That's what the currency issued by Massachusetts was, and Pennsylvania and other colonies. That's what they considered. I think the wording is not quite accurate, but that's what they considered the continental currency to be. And they argued over this at the convention. They spent very little time on it. The convention met from May to September. They only started talking about money in the middle of August. Now, this is all in chapter 14 and 15, I think, of my book. And essentially they were influenced by Adam Smith's definition, and they put aside a lot of the rich knowledge that we had gained in the colonial period using colony-created paper money. Gave us a country, among other things. Now, so that was left out of the Constitution for the most part. The part that was there and is in Article 1, Section 8, gives the government the power to create our money, and that's just fine. Now, it was after that convention occurred in let's see, I think 1791 is when the Federalists put through legislation for the first bank of the United States. And what they did was Well, what they did, there were three steps to what they did. Okay, step one, not firmly, explicitly place the money power into the government in the actual Constitution. They could have made it more clear. They left it slightly ambiguous. Okay, so that was step one. Step two was the bond theft, and here's what that was. There were, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, about $15 million, which was a lot of money at the time, in worthless colonial bonds that had been used during the Revolution. Then they became worthless. They were worth pennies on the dollar. They had been used to pay the soldiers and the merchants who supplied the Revolution, and they were valueless. So the Congress, and the Federalists in the Congress especially, behind closed doors, in secret, the Congress voted to turn them from pennies on the dollar to back them by the United States government, not just the old colonial governments, which were no longer in existence. So that $15 million was then paid out as a result of, general taxation of the United States. When it became clear that they were going to get that passed, the Federalists sent people throughout the country, agents throughout the country, buying up these old bonds for pennies on the dollar. And they funded the Federalist Party with that money. And Madison saw what was going on. He tried to stop it, and they beat him back by one vote. So that was the second step, to get that $10 to $15 million into the hands of the Federalists. The third step, they put through the legislation for the First Bank of the United States. Hamilton did it. And Hamilton was asked by President Washington. Washington sent this legislation to Hamilton and to Jefferson, asking for their comments on it. What do you think? Should I sign it? Now, of course, Hamilton wanted it. He's the one that had framed it. Jefferson said, no, don't do it. It's not in the Constitution, the power. And it was a very weak 5-page letter that he sent to Washington on it. Hamilton comes up with what is today 45 pages of typeset writing, and he tells him, yes, you have to do it, and he gives him all the reasons why you need a money power in society, none of which he could think of back at the time of the convention, when it might have had a chance to be put into the government. So they get the what Hamilton's final argument is in the letter to Washington is, suppose you need money quickly. Suppose there is a war, for example, and the government needs gold and silver quickly to fight the war. The only way that the people who have the gold and silver will do it is through such a bank. So the concept of money as gold and silver was the key to privatizing the money power in America. Had Washington and the Congress understood that they could have simply used fiat money just as well, that they could have created it out of thin air, well, they would not necessarily have passed the First Bank of the United States, wouldn't have come into existence. So Washington signs the bill. There is a First Bank of the United States, and the next step, they have to have a public underwriting, or just an underwriting. They were out to get, it was capitalized at $10 million, and so they offered the shares, which were oversubscribed in less than 2 hours, which is remarkable considering there's no telephones, hardly any roads and so on. And so what it turned out, this $10 million of the initial public offering of the First Bank of the United States, only 10% of it was ever paid in gold. The rest was paid in bonds. And the bonds that were used where those, the same ones that had been turned from pennies into dollars thanks to the U.S. government, the U.S. taxpayers. In other words, our country paid for the first bank of the United States, which was a privately owned bank. That's the way banking has always operated, in that kind of, I'm not going to call it tricky, it's much worse, a kind of fraudulent manner.
Maybe sinister?
Sinister is a good word, yeah. And what it amounted to, they said, our notes are backed by gold and silver on one condition, and that is that not a lot of people ask for the gold and silver. They never had it. Less than 1/10 of their shares came in gold. Less than a tenth. Now, so they ended up doing what they stopped the government from doing in the Constitutional Convention. Creating paper money out of thin air. But they did it privately. Now, fiat money is sneered at by the Ron Paul people, a lot of them, or by libertarians also, or the Austrian school. Fiat money, though, is not the problem, has never been the problem. It's the private creation of fiat money that is the problem, as occurred with that first Bank of the United States. The private creation of fiat money acts like a private tax on the rest of the society, because the society pays and ends up paying, giving value to the fiat money, the privately created fiat money. So it goes to the benefit of those with the privilege to create it, but it has to come from somewhere else, and that it comes from the society as a whole. Very sinister.
All right, you mentioned a few things. You mentioned the money power. You mentioned the continental currency that was America's first paper money. And
no,
you get
not the first. It was not the first.
What was
it? You see, it was the. Well, you had paper money issued by the colonies. Then you had that paper money, the continental currency, issued by the Confederation of States, not yet the United States.
Okay, correct. Can you explain how these guys got that money to fail? I know you just covered a lot of that, but could you summarize that a little bit?
How they got it to fail?
Right.
Oh, well, the colonial currencies did not fail. They have a rather excellent record.
Well, the continental currency, wasn't it due to
the continental currency.
Was it due to incompetent government or English counterfeiting?
No, it was not. And this is something the Austrian economists don't tell you, if they even know. The continental currency, 200 million were authorized, and 200 million plus replacement notes were actually issued. But the British counterfeited billions and billions of them. The Brits destroyed the continental currency, but not for a while. The continental currency still lasted for 5.5 years, and it took us to within 6 months of final victory against the Brits. So the story, not worth the continental, the whole story is never told, that it was British counterfeiting, not American or government incompetence, that caused it to finally fail.
That's a pretty important.
It is. It's a pretty big overlooking.
What about modern counterfeiting? Couldn't somebody do the same thing to undermine a new federal fiat money system?
Well, no, because even by the time of the greenbacks, the greenbacks printing had advanced so far to such an extent that the greenbacks could not be successfully counterfeited. in the 1860s. You see, so it's possible to detect counterfeiting.
All right.
So that doesn't turn out to be a big problem.
You just said the G word, so let's talk about the greenbacks.
Sure.
You know,
okay.
What were the greenbacks, and give us
Sure.
an understanding of it.
The greenbacks, our chapter 17 is devoted to the greenbacks, which were called the best money system we ever had, and by the people, they liked them. 450 million were authorized. Guess how many were issued? 450 million. They could not be successfully counterfeited. They eventually exchanged one greenback for one gold dollar. They exchanged at par with gold eventually. There was an initial inflation of the greenbacks and of everything during the Civil War. The price of against gold. The price of gold went up against all other commodities, and it went up against the greenbacks. But over time, the greenbacks stabilized, especially when they reached their limit of 450 million. And they worked really well. But we get another example from the greenbacks about what's not sufficient. It's not sufficient just for the government to issue greenbacks and allow the banks to keep creating money. Because the bankers during the Civil War, they created $1.49 for every dollar in greenback that was created. You must stop the key provision. You must stop fractional reserve banking. That is, any monetary reformer of any value knows that. And so this, it's another example of why we need those three elements, all three of them. Nationalization of the Fed, stop the banks from creating money, put money into circulation for infrastructure, including healthcare and education.
All right, let's summarize real quick, and you've already covered them, but give the main points brought up about why the government should not run our money system. If you could just give a few bullet points.
Well, the arguments that they bring up, and again, it's based on ignorance and not looking at the real facts. First argument that you always hear, oh, that would be inflationary if the government were to be creating our money. That would be inflationary. Now, the problem with that argument, why that argument is not accurate, is it depends on where the new money goes. If the government creates money and it goes into things that create goods and services and infrastructure, it's not inflationary. And the reason is that you, at the end of the process, you have the stuff that was created. You have the goods and services, or the infrastructure. Goods and services in abundance will keep prices down. Infrastructure, good infrastructure, increases efficiency of everybody in a society, and it helps to keep prices down. A good bridge across a river, uniting a city, is hugely beneficial to everybody, and everybody is more productive. And therefore, more production keeps the prices of goods and things down. You create new money and put it into warfare. Well, not only are you not creating new stuff, you're destroying stuff. That's always highly inflationary. But it depends on where the money is being directed. In the case of infrastructure, we have an example with the Erie Canal, where the cost, the Erie Canal allowed goods to be shipped from New York into what was then into Buffalo, therefore even to the Great Lakes in the Midwest. And it reduced the cost of shipping goods from $114 per ton down to $9 or $10 per ton. An example of how infrastructure expenditure is not inflationary. So that argument that it would be inflationary just doesn't hold water.
And not only that, but what do we have now with the private banking system? But
yes,
inflationary money.
Always compare it to what they're doing now. And what did they do? They were creating, before this, all the crisis, they were creating about $800 billion a year, the banking system. And 60-70% of it was going into real estate, the wrong real estate. And so they created a bubble in that area. How much of it was going into Wall Street speculation? How much of it was going into Wall Street acquisitions and buyouts? We once asked the Fed that, and they sent us back a note saying we don't publish those statistics. Yeah, well, if you look at what is being done now, or what was being done, they brought down the world. So our experience shows government money creation to be far superior to private money creation. And this last example, we shouldn't even be discussed. They ought to be embarrassed to bring up the argument.
Right.
But they're not, because they get away with it.
Well,
and this is where Americans got to get to be tougher.
What are some of the other points that are brought up?
Another big point, well, you can't trust the government.
Which is a government for and by the people.
Yeah, you can't trust the government. The government can't do anything right. That comes from the Adam Smith argument, which was brought into play to keep the money power in private hands. Well, the government, that's the kind of propaganda. It's the Sun Tzu system of propaganda. Best way to win a battle, convince the enemy not to fight. How? Convince the opposition that they can't win, then they don't fight. And that's part of that, that's the effect of that. You can't trust your own government. So who are you going to trust? Enron? That's your choice. And you laugh, but you may laugh. I used to use that example just like that, and about 6 months ago I found out that Enron indeed was on the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas.
Well, am I supposed to be surprised?
Yes. Skilling, the guy that's in jail, was on the board, Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Not Ken Lay himself, but his subordinate. So, at least if it's our government, even with the problems that we have, admitted problems that we have with our government right now, it's still superior. At least we can influence them if we vote and become better citizens.
Right, and not only that, if it's public, if it's government run, if there's a problem, in the way it's working at any given time, you go in, you analyze it, and you'd fix it. Whereas
yes.
Right now it's private, and they won't even let you audit it to figure out what is the problem.
Exactly right. You see, as soon as you privatize the money power, you cannot help but expect that they're going to run the money power for their own interests, their own private interests. And maybe not even in a vicious way. Yes, it has been vicious, but even if they weren't vicious, they would still say, well, these are the things we're interested in, so these must be the good. At least with the government in control, there's a potential, if not a guarantee, but at least a potential to promote the general welfare.
Right, and quote unquote national, instead of this false national security that they promote now.
Oh my God. No.
All right. Well, what can you say about Bush and Obama? Who do they work for?
President Obama.
And President Bush, both of them.
Bush always gave me a sort of a real bad feeling. Cheney too. I mean, they're talk about evil. With President Obama, I don't get the feeling of evil, so I guess that's positive. However, I'm extremely upset that he has Geithner, Sumner's, and who's the third guy? Geithner and Sumner's there. Oh, Rahm Emanuel. What are these guys doing in the White House? All three, any one of them, they don't belong there. President Obama, we were not told during the election, but within a week of his winning the presidency, we were told how much he enjoys the company of economists. And when I heard that, I said, oh, watch out. This is trouble. Now, what he's done, or rather hasn't done, on this health care bill, I think we've got a major problem, and I think it's going to be possibly addressed in the 2012 election for president. What he's doing so far is not in any way deserving of a re-election to presidency. And from what I'm seeing, I'm guessing that the powers behind the scenes are taking care of that through someone called Sarah Palin. If he can get him to run against her, then he will win. Sarah Palin would be to Obama what Senator Dole was to Clinton in getting him a second term, if you remember. I'm very upset with the way President Obama is working. I'm really happy that a black guy or a half-black, that an American black,
a non-white, how's that? A non-Caucasian.
A wonderful thing, a non-Caucasian. Yeah, I'm really happy about that because we have to grow up racially in this country, and we're not there yet. And I don't think his presidency is going to help us get there, by the way. At this rate, he's not going to be considered effective at all. And that is a shame and unnecessary. There's so much he could do, so much, but he's not doing it. Now, he's not doing the crazy sociopathic things that we got used to from Bush. And so compared to Bush, he's great. I'll say that.
You think so, huh? Even though he's causing all of this massive inflation and...
No. The Bush-Cheney thing, that was madness. That was madness at the highest level.
He's certainly not keeping to any of his promises about pulling troops out of anywhere.
Well, if you remember, he said he was going to stay in Afghanistan. He did.
Yeah, well, we don't even...
I remember the debate in Soldiers Field in Chicago, and he made that point, and Kucinich very quickly immediately challenged him on it.
Yeah.
Dennis should be president.
Well, no kidding, or Cynthia McKinney, or the both of them.
No, not Cynthia.
No?
No, not enough depth there. She needs more experience. She actually got mind-bleeped by these people who were talking about state banking. That just shows a lack of judgment. Sorry.
All right, well, we'll go back to that in a minute.
All right.
All right, well, let's tackle this Ayn Rand issue. And how did she obscure Aristotle's position in her books? And
yeah, that's interesting. She starts out Atlas Shrugged with several points of Aristotle, and it's like she's Aristotelian, but Aristotle was much more related and dependent on factual events and things and the actual world rather than just theory. Ayn Rand is total theory, which ends up with Alan Greenspan letting the banks run amok and bringing down the world economy. Ayn Rand, a feisty little Russian woman, but And she brought Russia down, you know.
Yeah, and she's not even, that Ayn Rand wasn't even her real name either.
I know, Anna Rosenberg. But she not only brought Russia down, she brought America down through her student, Alan Greenspan.
Right.
And, yeah. You see, life is not that simple as she thought, that just reason, is the only way to know things. We know things through various mechanisms. Some of it's intuition. All of it comes back to experience, always. And to glorify reason to the extent that she did had to mean a denigration or ignoring of experience. And that always leads to disaster. And it has led to disaster here. Now, I want to recommend for your listeners, they must get a hold of, or they can watch the Frontlines show called The Warning. Have you seen that yet?
I don't recall seeing that.
All right. Frontlines, they're a PBS television
right. It's been on for a couple of decades, hasn't it?
Yeah, I'm not something like that. They have different quality of producers and directors. Some of their shows are wonderful, some stink. They did a marvelous show called The Warning, which gives the story of how one woman, I'm not anti-feminine in any sense, there's a woman who was in charge of the CFTC, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, in the 90s. Her name was Brooksley Bourne. And she warned in the 90s about this crash. And what she did was she saw a problem in derivatives, which are just futures. But these were unregulated derivatives, meaning they're not traded on an exchange. They were just traded between players. And they were fraudulently organized. And the reason she found out about it was when Procter & Gamble or some other cosmetic company sued their bank for millions and millions of dollars, claiming that they were taken advantage of with this derivative trade. And nobody knew how many there were out there. Nobody had any picture of it because there's no exchange. They were not on any they were not regulated. So she went to Greenspan. This is all documented in this movie. Your people have to see it. Just Google Frontlines, then go to The Warning. Anyway, there's one, I won't tell the whole story, but she goes to Greenspan and she says, my commission, we're going to examine the derivatives thing because there's tremendous opportunity for fraud here. And Greenspan tells her, and this was remarkable to me, because it's not a part of libertarian theology. Greenspan tells her, oh, we don't worry about fraud. The market will take care of the fraud. Now, that comes from Ayn Rand's nonsense. Actually, Ayn Rand didn't make that mistake. She thought that you should have government take action against force and fraud. Anyway, the show shows how Greenspan, Sumner, and Rubin destroyed that woman in Congress. And so the thing never got done. The job never got done. And that is what caused the 2008 destruction. So the show's called The Warning. Do see it. See it tomorrow.
I will absolutely do that. What has been the negative impact? Obviously, the destruction of our economy and the Soviet Union's, but what has been the negative impact of her economic policy today, and what can you say to those who parrot Ayn Rand's work?
Okay. The negative impact, she was mind-bleeped by the Austrian school. Okay? She was a lightweight when it came to a lot of things. And I found that I've read everything she's written 3, 4, 5 times. I know her stuff better than the libertarians do. And she did not understand money. She took the Austrian school position, money is gold. Okay. And so the Austrians did that to her, and then the libertarians formed around her, against her wishes, by the way. The Libertarian Party is heavily influenced by her, and therefore the Austrians through her. She said, stay away from those people, the libertarians. They're only there to steal my ideas. They're the only ones promoting her ideas, actually.
That's funny.
And so she's created that attitude, which is commonly called, the worship of free markets. I would call it a deification of markets, is where it has ended up. And all of the destruction that's done, and the holding back of thinking about real solutions that it comes out of that attitude. She's done more damage in the 20th and still into the 21st century than virtually any philosopher. If you want to call her a philosopher, I'm not really sure I don't think she qualifies as a real philosopher. This is nothing against women. I idolize that woman, Brooksley Born. When you see that show, you'll understand. But, gosh, you cannot come at the world with the degree of bitterness that she did. That came out of the Soviets ruining her life as a teenager when she was in Russia. They took her dad's drug company or pharmacy, I'm not sure what it was, and made things very difficult for her as she was growing up.
All right, would you mind...
You want to be careful about getting some of these women too angry at you.
Would you like to discuss G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island?
Well, I think it's a ripoff of a book by what's his name, Eustace Mullins, who wrote a book called what's it called? The
Secrets of the Federal Reserve.
That's it, Secrets of the Federal Reserve. He wrote it in 1952 or 1949. It was the first book that really explained how the banking system works. Believe it or not, it was the first time it was really made public to people what was going on. And Eustace Mullins had the help of. He was working as a research librarian at the Library of Congress in Washington, and he had help of a dozen other research librarians there, and they put together the material that documented how at Jekyll Island, the secret meeting of bank executives framed the setup of the Federal Reserve System. And that's where that book is based on, the one you talked about by, what's his name, Griffin. Yeah.
Right.
I wouldn't take that book seriously. Anything in there that's positive comes from Mullins, and at the same time, Griffin associated gold with it, which means he's acting against whatever good Mullins brought forward.
Right, and not only that,
propaganda technique to associate junk with good stuff.
And then what he did was he tied a lot of the Ayn Rand economic theory into the end of that book as well. So he took out the good that Mullins did and threw in the bad that Rand did.
I would have to consider it total disinformation.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I can't read his mind. I don't know if it's purposeful. I would lean in that direction personally, in my opinion. That would be my opinion, which I am allowed to have in America. Now, that book got a lot of heavy promotion too. A lot of gifting to libraries. You find it in libraries everywhere. And
you find, he's been on Rush Limbaugh and all this stuff, but
really,
yeah,
oh, no kidding. I thought only George Bush got on Rush Limbaugh.
Now,
Limbaugh, I said Ayn Rand did a lot of damage. I guess Limbaugh's up there pretty high, too, in doing damage to our country. What's unfortunate is some of these people seem to be getting paid in proportion to how much damage they're doing.
Right. That I think about summarizes it. The more criminal your actions are, the faster you're promoted. But didn't G. Edward Griffin work for the John Birch Society, who was for promoting the gold standard? I think he even authored a book for the John Birch Society.
I don't know. I've saw enough about it to know I didn't have to read it.
All right. So, what is the issue regarding state banks, and why exactly are state banks? Why are they a bad thing?
That's a distraction. It's so bad. I don't know if it's on purpose bad or if it just turns out to be bad. But it does some horrible things. It tells the states to go into banking, to go into fractional reserve banking. Now, in other words, the state governments would be endorsing that vicious system. Every serious monetary reformer knows that that fractional reserve banking is no good. It's at the heart of the problem. And if the states go into it, they'd be endorsing it. They'd be condoning it. Exactly the wrong direction to go in. Now, the person who promotes that claims to be an incrementalist. Oh, we have to do things one thing at a time, a little thing. And she claims that our American Monetary Act would be too difficult to do. But incrementalism is supposed to move in the right direction, not 180 degrees in the wrong direction. You see? So that's the main problem with it. But in addition to that, we're at the moment in a crisis here, the one time that we have a chance to change the system. This is the only time that we'll have to potentially get real monetary reform. And to divert people into nonsense at that critical moment, that's very bad. So I just see a number of bad aspects to that. Now, the person promoting that, by the way, in her book, she's against fractional reserve banking, and then she's promoting a system of fractional reserve banking. There's no reform in it whatever.
Who's that?
I'm not even going to mention the name.
You ever get any spooks bothering you?
Any what?
Spooks.
Yeah, sure. Spooks, yeah. Good word for them. You mean like the LaRouches?
Oh, and anybody just trying to mess up the game plan. I would suppose that you would be...
Yeah, we do get them. We track them on the Internet.
I would suppose that you would be public enemy number one for the Federal Reserve and guys like Geithner and these other criminals.
No. They're not the ones that are doing that. The bankers are not the ones that are protecting banking. They hardly realize what they're doing. But the LaRouches are out there that they do a lot of protecting of the banking system.
Really?
Yeah. I finally figured out what the guy does. His job is to, or their job is to maintain the status quo. How? They'll give enough information about problems, and then they'll go off the deep end on solutions. They won't provide any solution, so people won't know what to do. And then in effect, they smear reformers in general just by being there as pretended reformers. It gives all reformers a bad name. These guys were heavily involved in disrupting these meetings that the Congress people were trying to have with their constituents. And that's unfortunate. In effect, it's kind of an attempt to isolate the Congress from our people.
You know, there was one interesting subject in your book that I wanted to have you discuss quickly, if you wouldn't mind, or if it's possible to discuss it quickly. How, in your opinion, did the pagan religions affect Rome's monetary stability? You refer to Sir James George Fraser's work there. And I wanted to ask you, in regards to that information, let me let you answer that, and then we'll go from there.
That's in chapter 2, and it's fascinating, and it's hard to remember it all. I would have to reread my chapter 2 to answer your question. But basically, Roman religion was wide open for a long time, in the sense of they were pragmatic about it. Does it help the state? Then it's okay, and if not, then it's not. And what happened at one point? Let's see, what was it? Now it's coming back to me. The war with Hannibal, Second Punic War. A third of all Romans died. They were getting into a feeling of real desperation, and so the cult, or the goddess, the priests of Cybele, or Cybele, I guess it is, which was embodied in a black stone in Turkey at the time, or what is now Turkey, convinced them in a moment of desperation that if they bring the stone to Rome, that they'll have a chance to overcome this losing situation with Hannibal. So they bring the stone, and they put it on Palatine Hill. And what's the rest of that story? I can't remember it.
Well, that's all right. It was just interesting, that section of your book. I'm not,
it's fascinating. Every time I reread it, it's.
I study a lot of ancient cultures and religions and things like that, and written a couple books on it. And to be honest with you, that may be the only area in your book that I wasn't sure if I agreed on or not, because I was questioning about the many tribes and their individual religions that existed before Rome, that Rome sought specifically to destroy, and and how Rome's Christianity affected that stability, even though it was out massacring and causing such destruction against these tribal cultures that existed there before.
They did that a lot in the north, didn't they, in Scandinavia?
Oh, yeah, and, not just there, but, you had all of these Celtic, or, and that's sort of a generic word, but... And they were highly civilized cultures. In fact, a friend of mine, Professor Carl Ruck at Boston University, has a brand new book, "The Drug Cult Mithras, the Drug Cult that Civilized Europe," that's due out any time now. That goes into a lot of these ancient cults and how they had brought such high civilization and stability, and then Rome came and wiped them out and sort of subverted them.
Oh, fascinating. Now, I'm trying to remember the damage that was done by Cybele, because apparently that was the only time they allowed any foreign cult to come in. But I can't remember what damage that cult did in Rome, but it was significant. Anyway.
We'll have to cover that another time if...
That would be good to cover, because it's fascinating. I'll reread my chapter, and there's a heck of a lot in that book. Every time I reread it, I remember things that I've forgotten.
Before we start wrapping things up, and I've got a few last questions here before we get into the final home stretch here, but I wanted to have you discuss J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds, and if you've ever come across any information in your research regarding one of J.P. Morgan's vice presidents by the name of R. Gordon Wasson, if you would remember that.
No, I would remember that, and I have not. I didn't get too much into some of the conspiracy aspects of what has always gone on for a reason, and that is that how are you going to prove it? And I try to avoid conspiracy type considerations because I don't see how it gets us forward in terms of getting the reform. And reform is at the heart of what we're doing. It's not knowledge for its own sake.
Can it be helpful in the way that it shows us how things happened? In other words, to know history is to not repeat it?
Well, yeah, but I don't know if you can really say that you know the history of that, because a lot of how can you really demonstrate?
I guess you would have to find primary documents, wouldn't you?
Well, yeah, and it's very difficult. It's very difficult to be able to do that, and you might be misinterpreting stuff in a way. To my mind, the big conspiracies are always wide open and public, if you know what I mean.
I do, and it seems to me that, they like to hide the conspiracies right in plain sight where nobody looks.
Yeah. Aspects of the Bible, for example.
Right.
So I have this problem with some of the conspiracy thinking, and that is that it gets too loose. It's really not documentable. And for example, in the money area, okay, you hear a lot of the Rothschilds are in control of the Federal Reserve, for example. Used to hear that all the time, less and less now. Well, in fact, what that did is largely identify study of monetary reform or study of money as anti-Semitic, in a way. Now, there are aspects of the Rothschilds that were very bad. We know that, and other bankers too. But I did not find, in examining the history of it, that they were ever really crucial in creating the ideas. They used them effectively, but I did not find that they did that. That they created fractional reserve banking and this fraud. You find it in the Italian city-states in 1100, 1200. And so it just did not come up in the research. Now, I've read a few books on the Rothschilds, know a bit about what they did. If anyone ever found the quote of Rothschild who said, I care not who controls the laws if I control the money,
Right.
Well, you never see where that came from. I question whether it's real.
Really?
There are a number of quotes out there in the monetary area which are not real. Most of the Lincoln quotes on the greenbacks are not real. The quotes from British newspapers about the greenbacks, they're not real. And the reason I say that, I looked for them in order to be able to put Lincoln's so-called quotes into my book, but I couldn't do it unless I found the source, where it was from, and I found out that they don't exist.
Interesting.
Yeah. Found out where they came from, too. They came from a Canadian guy, a good guy, McGear, who set up and repaired the Canadian money system in the 1930s really well. But what he wrote was, if Lincoln were to describe this, he would probably say, and then he gave these wonderful greenback quotes. But it wasn't from Lincoln.
Oh, that's funny.
And then they got published. Then that stuff got published as a Senate document, and people in England thought that made them real until I explained to them, look, any senator could put anything they want into that as a Senate document. Does not qualify as a source. Anyway.
All right. What is the difference between money and credit, and why is that important to understand?
That is so important. That is how our money system got mangled and is now what it is. You see, it's not. We don't have a money system, Jan. We have a credit system, and depending. This is one of the big achievements of my book, is to identify this problem. And what it's gone so far, and I mentioned this at the House of Lords when I gave a talk there in '04. It's gone so far as the attempted removal of a concept from the English language. And the concept they're trying to remove is the concept of money. And they've been substituting the idea of credit for the idea of money. Now, the reason this is important is that the concept of money determines who controls the money system. For example, if money is considered to be wealth, such as gold and silver, then it's going to be controlled by the wealthy. They're going to control not only their wealth, not only their stuff, they'll control the money system, which gives them power to, double and triple that up, to control and gain much more. So that's one of the problems defining money as gold. If you define money as credit, then you handy over the money power to those who specialize in credits, the bankers. Now, the greenbacks, for example, they were a money system. They were a money system because that little piece of paper was the money. If it promised to pay something, then it would not have been money. It would have been credit. And the money would have been what was promised. You see, this is not an easy concept because we are so used to thinking of money and credit interchangeably because that's what the economists have done. They did this slowly, or this happened slowly. At one point, for example, there was a distinction between high-powered money and lower-powered money. The high-powered money was actually money, and the lower-powered money was credit. So that was a way of shifting over. Today, they're just talking about credit, and they're even misidentifying actual money as credit. For example, they're trying to say that when the government issues money, it's government-issued credit. It's not credit, it's money. And when you think of the greenbacks, you just think of that little piece of paper, not a promise to pay something later. It itself, the little piece of paper, was the money. Now, it doesn't have to be in physical existence. It can be in existence on an accounting sheet as well. This would be the single most important thing for the economists to realize, this difference between money and credit. We don't have a money system. We don't have money circulating, Jan.
We have credit and debt.
Credit circulating, and credit evaporates in a crisis. Money does not. This is a hugely important concept, and our American Monetary Act, which Congressman Kucinich renamed the American Monetary and Financial Security Act, gets rid of a private credit system and puts into place a government money system. I hope your listeners will just spend some time mulling that over in their minds, because it may not be obvious, but that is so important, this difference between money and credit. Credit is a promise to pay. Money is money. Credit, a promise to pay money. We've got too much credit, which the other half of that is debt, which means interest payments, which means
slavery.
A system that is unsustainable, which is what we have. We can't afford to have that run by people who would allow the world to fall apart economically because they had to get bonuses of so many $1 billion by pretending they were making profits on derivatives.
Stephen, why do you recommend a fourth branch of government?
Well, we're not really recommending that in this way. What it is there should have been 4 branches. There are 4 branches, always. The 4th branch is the monetary branch. Now, when you say recommending, we're not saying that's what we have to do to solve the problem, set up a 4th branch of government. And the reason we're not saying that is that's a big constitutional amendment type of thing, and we can get the effects of it through very specific laws. One law in particular, American Monetary and Financial Security Act, which people can find at our website, which is at monetary.org, and read that, and they can understand that. And we achieve the elements, we achieve through that reform the benefits. It's virtually not quite the same as having a 4th branch, but what we set up within the Treasury, we put the Federal Reserve into the Treasury as a kind of quasi-independent part of the Treasury. We don't just concentrate all the power in the executive branch, because there are congressional conditions that have to be met, and the monetary authority reports not only to the president, but it reports to the Congress, to both the Senate and the House of Representatives, which have to both be involved in confirmation of them. And so in that sense, that's what we're promoting, rather than a 4th branch at this time. If we were at the Constitutional Convention, we would promote a 4th branch, which would have been the best time to set it up that way.
Well, and a lot of libertarians accuse you of ignoring the quote-unquote libertarian issue, and I know we've talked a lot about that today, but I know you cover this.
What is libertarian issue? What do they mean?
Well, it's kind of funny. It's whether it's going back to those socialist labels and things like that, or too much government, or you can't have more government, that your plan would only create more government or something. And I see it as the opposite, because the money would go to specifically where things are needed, not bureaucracies to shell up and shore up the current system.
Yeah. Well, you can tell the libertarians that I know their master Ayn Rand, what she's written better than they do. I almost became a libertarian back in the 1970s, before I did the monetary research and understood how wrong she was about it. One of the reasons I didn't become libertarian is Ayn Rand told all of us not to. I know their game. I know what they're up to. They're trying to do good. They're not bad people. They're not evil. But they have a psychological problem. And they want to think that they think they can increase their power by believing in the total importance of reason and not paying so much attention to actual experience. And they are unable, as a result of that, they're unable to evaluate experience. They're unable to evaluate the facts. They think today, given this crisis that we're facing, they actually think that there was too much government regulation. You've seen them saying that.
Right.
They're crazy. Now, that when for anybody who says too much government regulation, it causes problems, you're dealing with a real mental case there. Now, why do libertarians want to do that? I can figure them out from time to time. I can tune into them, but I haven't bothered for quite a while. And they've made themselves irrelevant. They don't get votes. They don't. No libertarian candidate really gets anywhere. Their function is to actually provide backbone for all the Republican nonsense. That's what they do. And why bother with them? They're not going to be around. This generation goes away and they're finished. There's nobody else there for nobody.
To summarize, what can Americans do to take back America and our money system?
Read my book. Really. You have to read my book.
Actually, I would agree with that, and I've recommended your book to many, many, many people.
Thank you.
And
That's not all. That's not all.
All right.
Then you have to get active. First of all, you have to assume we're going to win and take actions in harmony with winning rather than with losing. Because if we don't win, then there's no future for the human race anyway. So it's a no-loss, it's a heads you win, tails you don't lose situation.
I would agree with that.
You know what I mean?
I do.
And that's important to go forward with that attitude. Don't let anything stop you. Do it for the best among us, not for everybody, because a lot of our fellow Americans don't deserve what we're going to give them. I mean, the good things that are going to come out of this. But think of the wonderful, bright children growing up, expecting to see a good world and ready to help it become that way. Think of them as the ones we're working for.
Every day.
Those are the ones we're working for. And they deserve it. And what you can call that humanity, And I don't think we're here without a purpose, and I don't think that the purpose is only what we give it, what we create as purpose. I think that there are other aspects that we have a part in this universe that we have not fully imagined yet.
Stephen, what is the single most important idea you would like people to take away from this interview?
Oh, I don't know if I have just a single. We can, as Kucinich says, whenever he gives a talk anywhere, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, never doubt that you are able, through our working with our governmental processes, to improve the situation in our country. Never doubt that we're capable and will improve things. It may take time, but it will happen. It does happen. Look, slavery is gone, or much of it.
At least the in-your-face slavery.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Now they just do it with credit and debt.
Yeah.
They got slicker and wiser.
And so help your friends understand this. Other thoughts from this interview. Stay in touch. Let's work on this together.
You too.
And never get discouraged. And, well, don't worry about the libertarians.
All right, Stephen. Please give out your website and information and where people can go to buy your books. And
Sure.
I know it says that it's not available on Amazon and all that good stuff.
No, they've been hard to work with. We might put it on there eventually. But they can go to our website to get the book, which is monetary.org. And you can also find out about the conferences there. And please make donations there. If your people happen to have good jobs, that's wonderful. We'd appreciate any kind of donation because that's how we go forward.
And that's exactly the case with this show as well.
Oh, okay. And if after reading the book, if you've got suggestions, please send them in and stay in touch. But
Great.
After reading the book, because before, it's hard to be in a position to really make suggestions. It really is.
Yeah, well, you're not on the same page yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
and we answer many of the questions there.
Exactly.
Now,
well, Stephen, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We have a little 32-page brochure on our website, which is going to be available, and it's the kind of thing that you can hand to somebody, and it gives them enough of a background on the monetary reform, what to do, the history, and so on. We're hoping that becomes a good tool for advancing the message.
And Stephen, thank you so much for coming back on. Yeah.
No, thank you for bringing this attention to us. And you do great interviews. You really, I mean, I'm not saying that I did a great interview, but you ask the right questions.
Well, I appreciate that. And you bring the right information to the table, so I guess that works well together, doesn't it?
Okay. Well, let's stay in touch.
All right, definitely.
All right.
We'll talk soon. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.